Hello.
Yep.
Nice. Audio working again.
How's everybody doing today?
Goals to stay cool. For those of you not in the Seattle area, I think it's supposed to be like 92 or 3 up here, depending on kind of where you are, which is pretty hot for us.
Oh, we're finally gonna break past the 80s, I see.
For sure. I've already got the windows closed to try and keep it from heating up in here. Keep the AC from having to kick on, hopefully for a couple more hours.
All righty. I think we're probably good to get started. I added this agenda item. We touched on it last time, but Jay and I met yesterday and chatted a bit about it. And it kind of, it opened up some additional questions, but it was good to kind of refresh on this doc here. I think to kind of summarize, like, what we came to was like, so looking at the options broken down here, option 5, it's this multi-action with matching, is going to be the most robust solution. It's also probably a lot of work. It's a big change. But it gives us pretty flexible control over the behavior of the constraints. And then looking at, I think it was option 3, this audit flag. This is probably going to be the easiest way to satisfy the ask in a timely manner, because it's likely a smaller change. And so we kind of broke out these open questions here. Like, it would be cool to get a pulse on the priority of the initial ask, which the issue was excluding a specific constraint from audit. And then, yeah, the other 2 dashes here are mostly what I just said. And then Jay also brought up the question of backwards compatibility. Jay, do you feel like I covered everything that we talked about?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, so there's more than just like, is this complex to implement? Is this easy to implement? Is this expressively powerful? Is this not expressively powerful? For instance, option 3, the having an audit specific field, one feature or effect that has is that in the constraint schema basically raises audit to a position that no other enforcement point has, right? Like if you think about the Gator CLI or even admission, right? None of those have a field specifically only meaningful to them, right? And that to me signifies an API design problem, right? Where when you're starting to associate specific use cases with the schema, right? It works in the short term, right? And it works for the direct problem. But then you also establish a pattern where, okay, well, then if the next problem is with webhooks, right? Then you need a special flag for webhooks, and then you start to get somewhat brittle results over time, right? So that would be my concern with option 3. Option 5 is better from that perspective, but entangling the match criteria with the actions. One, I think you pointed out the backwards compatibility bit. There'd be needing to answer the question, you know, how if someone has root match criteria, right? Like, because that couldn't go away because backwards compatibility. How would this interact with those? I would also be curious about, you know, one thing about match criteria is that that's another thing that I think is underspecified, right? You could imagine, and I am like pulling from something called Terraform Validator here, but the concept is more important than the specific thing. If you have something like Terraform, which essentially wraps or has the ability to wrap a Kubernetes object inside of, say, a Terraform plan, it could be nice to essentially have 2 levels of matching, right? Like you want to match, if you're in Terraform, like, is this the appropriate module where this thing should be enforced, right? Which may have some coupling with enforcement action, because you can imagine like the dev module you enforce in like sort of a warning mode, where as if it's like prod, you shouldn't commit that particular change. And then also as a K8s object, you would definitely want to still perform like Kubernetes style matching. So it's thinking through how those two things relate. I don't know if I could give you an off the cuff kind of like conclusion as to, you know, combining this like multi-enforcement with matching is clearly bad in terms of, you know, dealing with that kind of situation, or if it would actually improve things. I do think knowing more about how we would want to do that might be helpful, right? Because there is some risk of making the backwards compatibility problem worse. And yeah, then there's just the question of like spreading your intent across multiple tiers of overlapping fields, right? Because we're gonna, as I said, keep spec.match for backwards compatibility, and needing to then figure out how those things map, but also how they fold out into that more difficult, I call it like the multi-target matching concept. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's starting to. I think so. It was helpful to talk to Jay about it yesterday, because I don't have much experience like actually in the Gatekeeper code base at all. So I'm looking at this doc purely from a customer experience point of view. And so yeah, take any of my thoughts in that context, and then Jay was able to kind of help think through some of the technical aspects of it yesterday. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, and those are, I haven't honestly looked through the doc yet, so I can't remember the other options, but in hearing the summary of those two, those are my top of mind thoughts.
I forgot who was driving this design.
I think originally Sir Tesh had authored this.
Yeah, I authored this and then Max added stuff. And then I think Xander was looking at this. No.
Okay, because it's been a while and I'm not sure if all the comments are addressed either. So if y'all feel like there is like a clear one or two options that we want to discuss, then maybe highlight that and make sure the ones that y'all feel that need more time should probably make sure all the comments are addressed for those few options. It's kind of hard to grok just by looking at this right now. Because it's been a while.
Yeah.
Like Xander, I think you mentioned option 3 and 5. Does that mean all the other options are not relevant anymore, or, and if so, maybe just move them down or something, right? And then for 3 and 5, make sure all the comments are addressed for
Sounds good.
the options. Yeah.
Yeah, I can do that, and you know, I'll just keep dropping this on the agenda, and yeah.
Yeah, I think we need to select one and kind of like work towards that one because we have so many options. And it does get confusing.
We can probably forget about 4 without thinking about it because 5
Actually,
is essentially extension
sorry.
of it.
No, four is I think a valid candidate here. Like we shouldn't just go, oh, functionality superset, right? Like as I said, when we're weighing these are API changes, right? So what when we're weighing these, we're not just looking at expediency or expressive power for the change in isolation. What we're looking at is how does this change mesh onto both what we would like to do in the future and how users might use the thing in aggregate. Right.
That's helpful to hear that 4 still has some merit in that case. Like I think you know, then I'll add that to the list of ones that I need to address the comments on, and maybe that's like a good maybe by next week, if we can establish, like, rule out which of these are not valid, then I think that's a good starting point.
Maybe we can just look at 4 and 5. Because I think Max had some concerns about the option 3. And I think 1 and 2 has some other shortcomings. So we can just focus on 4 and 5.
Do we need to understand more about the space too? Like one thing I'm leery of just approach wise is what metric are we measuring these by, right? Like because these are solutions to one or more problems, right? But you know, what are the things we're trying to achieve? And if we don't know that, if we don't know kind of the space, then when we're looking at these options, one, we might be missing even a better option, but 2, it's going to be like somewhat arbitrary, right? Like which one we decide to choose.
Yeah, I think the motivation is at the beginning. So I think that describes the user pain points in what we can't do and what the users wants to do.
Right. So if we focus just on a single issue, right? Like what is the functionality we want to add for a specific issue? We do miss opportunities like hitting two birds with one stone, right? If there's a cluster of similar issues, if we know there's like a roadmap thing, if there's functional, if roadmap thing where one choice or another could like make things more easy, if there's similar functional gaps that we are aware of. For instance, for multi-action or options 4 or 5, I remember one reason I wanted to have something like that was to support things like PubSub, right? And you could imagine an enforcement action of PubSub to this specific, what are we calling it, provider, this specific queue on this provider. So you can start to funnel the violations to appropriate audiences.
Yeah, I think that those are all in the motivation. Can you scroll up onto the motivation section, Xander? It's at the very top.
I'm curious. I'll spend some time over the next week looking to. So like, yeah, looking at the initial issue, the ask was exclude constraint from audit, which surfaced, I think, what we have here, which is how can we get more granular control over the behavior of constraints as it relates to enforcement actions and namespaces. I'm curious how like tools like Caverno and stuff do like provide that level of customization, if at all. I'll do some reading this week.
How they do it, different levels of enforcement for different names. Yeah.
Yeah, like if you know, how do they provide the kind of flexibility that we're trying to target here? Like, yeah, I haven't used Caverno, so
yeah,
I'm really curious.
one sort of implicit thing in the doc too is that we don't have a single constraint resource, right? And there are also other resources on the cluster. So it's not necessarily like if I compare 4 and 5, it's not necessarily true that things are less expressible between 4 and 5. They are expressible differently, right? Like if you wanted to have different enforcement actions for different namespaces, right, or whatever. For 4, that would look like having multiple constraints. For 5, you could wrap that in a single constraint. And so but you know that doesn't mean they're equivalent, right? Like 5 then makes that intent atomic, right? Like you can overwrite a constraint in one go, and might have some benefits in terms of like packaging the intent as well, right? Like users can put it in a single file name. It will be under a single resource. If they're using like, I don't know, annotations to document reasoning, they might map a little cleaner. Again, I don't want to like take what I'm saying off the cuff and say this means X and Y is clearly better. Just more when you're looking at the thing, it's important to know like how the system can mesh.
It's also a little confusing for me that the motivation section has like options in there. It's almost like saying some of the options address these use cases and some of them don't. So it almost suggests that the motivation isn't a common one across the options, which seems kind of odd, right? In theory, all the options should solve these pain points, right?
Yeah, so what happened, there I think is there were less motivation, like less use cases first, and then initial options were developed on it, and then we kept adding into motivation and then further expand the options as well. So
Then may I suggest maybe group the motivations into like, I don't know, like use case 1, use case 2, or whatever, to help us identify which use case are we trying to solve and which one maybe we want to punt it for later. I think that's also going to help move the conversation a little bit. Otherwise, it feels like we're trying to solve many problems with the same design. And if that is not the goal, then we're just going to go back and forth a lot.
Extremely reminiscent of a certain internal Microsoft project that we've been working on lately, Rita.
Yeah. So like one suggestion could be like, I don't know, like out of these motivations, which one are we targeting first, right? And I think that's going to help identify the option we want to go with.
Yeah,
And-
like, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, I just want to make sure we're clear about which problem we want to solve first, and then maybe the other problems are nice to have, or we want to make sure that the solution addresses that maybe later, but that is not the goal of this design. Does that make sense?
I think I agree with you. I just want to like test. Like, so I get the sense there's like two different lenses you could look at the motivation thing then. One is we're just going to put everything that we think could be potentially related to what we're doing, right? So like things like various behaviors that we've either know people want or we want that might be supportable, or various concerns that we want to be sure we don't accidentally step on, right? Like, oh, we should try to make sure the design doesn't keep us from doing X, Y, or Z. And then we want to sort of debate what's in scope versus what's out of scope. Like what will be breaking in terms of a design? Like, oh, this doesn't satisfy this, therefore the design is bad.
That's right.
Versus what is like sort of an indicator of like between two good options, like tiebreakers or whatever.
Yeah.
And then the other way of looking at it could be prioritization, right? Like, oh, this design could technically satisfy all of these things, but priority 1 is this behavior. So we're going to implement like a subset of the design, and then the rest can be like to be implemented. But it's cool that the design knows that it can accommodate that. Is it both of those? Is it one of those?
I think prioritizing is a good next step because it's going to help move the conversation. What I want to avoid is us optimizing on a design to solve a problem that may actually be like low in priority.
Yeah. And for me, I think having a bunch of motivations, what it keeps us from doing is, I don't want to name specific projects, but one pattern I've noticed is if people are laser focused on like user story, implement a thing, user story, implement a thing, without like looking to find like greater themes, you wind up with more configurability overall than you would have before. And you can wind up with stuff that either just like doesn't mesh, or you wind up with stuff that's just like way too complex for what it does because there's a specific knob for everything. And that can also lead to users not being able to self-help, right? Because they need us to code in a solution because it's like hard coded into a field, versus if we had left things open, like how you could write Rego in a constraint template, users might be able to do something, right? And then if there's a better thing we could do, like we could work on that, but they're not stuck in the interim.
I think there's a balance, right? And we also don't want it to be too generic and then too grander in scope, and then it's just going to take forever to address all the use cases.
Yeah. Like hopefully there's some way of both short circuiting the analysis and stepping the development, whatever, like doing development in phases.
An elegant, simple design that also scales.
Must be easy, right?
Is that a buzzword from something that has the air of a quote about it?
Nope, just yeah, that's what I'm hearing. That's what we're looking for.
It is like what could a banana cost? Like $10.
$10.
Oh, that was a good show. Should have named the project Banana Stand. Sorry, yeah.
No, so I was just gonna my action items that I'm taking from this is I'm gonna see if I can get a sense of prioritization on the motivations here and try and break that down a little bit. I will go through and try to address comments here. But I think for next week, I will try to have these motivations a little more organized and prioritized. And I think that will help, at least what I'm hearing is that will help inform the design a little bit.
And if you see any that are missing, right? Because it's been a while, maybe we've learned a thing or two.
Yeah, we have pops up now, so we can have more opinions there.
And may I ask, like, when this doc is at a good stopping point, like, can y'all ask for review before this call, just so that we have eyes on it?
Yep. Cool. Thank you for the discussion, everyone. It's very helpful. Anyone have any ad hoc agenda items?
The new prototype code got merged. So as far as I could tell, let me know if anyone has had misgivings since the last time about the VAP, like K8s native stuff. But it's now in alignment with what's in the doc. So yeah, I guess, do we want to move forward assuming that's how we want to do things, or is there more iteration we want to do?
Oh, what do you mean any more?
Any more? Sorry, was it? Sorry, you said, what do I mean anymore?
Yeah. Do you mean what's next?
Yeah. So, like, there's this doc with, this is what the cell will look like. Here's everything's in like variables.params or whatnot. And here's the fields you can define. Here's the shape of it. And that stuff is in alignment now. And so honestly, let's see, that good.
I think last time we talked about next steps would probably be taking some of the existing constraint templates and write some cell-based ones just to give folks an idea, right? Like maybe in library or something.
Yeah, we can do
then,
like an experimental section or something like that, so people can like pilot it.
Yeah, and obviously docs. I think Jay is working on that. And then whenever, I guess, like at least wait till it's beta, right? Wait till VAP is beta so that we could start working on the creating VAP, like in-tree VAP resources. That's another issue that is still open currently, but it's not blocking anything, I don't think.
Isn't it beta now? It's just not
I
enabled.
think it's 120. Wait, is it?
It is in 128, it is beta, it's just not enabled because of the
Right.
whole beta are not enabled by default confusion.
Hmm.
So do we feel like beta is stable enough for us to go look at that, or wait?
I think, yeah, because like beta invokes backwards compatibility requirements in K8s, right?
In theory, yes.
Oh no.
Asterisk.
I mean,
What's the-
it's good to start looking at it, I think.
Yeah,
But
I think so
again, it
too.
doesn't block anybody from using it today. It is
Yeah.
my point, yeah.
Yeah, and there's so what I'm hearing is one, like actually writing some of this stuff. It's not meaning this stuff, meaning cell-based constraint templates.
Yeah.
It's not clear to me where they would live, but that's okay, I think, for now. Like it will be simple enough to, rehome them. I can, write out some examples for sure. I don't think I want to convert all of the library, but some representative sample. And the other problem would be generating these VAP objects, which one problem is the actual generation, but the second problem is controlling whether and when the generation takes place, right? Like, do users provide a flag? Is there an annotation they provide on the constraint template or that says whether it should be generation, some combination of both, right? Like, I feel like you probably want the granularity, just so that you can like try things and like surgically roll back the ones that don't work, if necessary. But I also think you probably don't want to like always be updating everything individually.
Would we want to auto-generate VAP if the API is present? Is that like a good way to differentiate?
I think not. Because, well, okay. Here's my theory for not, and then I'll say why it could be flawed. So not would be if I'm upgrading to say K8s 128 or whenever it like gets exposed to the API. Do we want to just like assume then that the user is fine enabling that feature, or do they want to have some sort of controlled rollout and method of rolling back if it doesn't work without rolling back their entire cluster? The theory where I say I'm going too far with that is if users are, sort of doing best practices and no one cluster is precious. And so their gradual rollout is cluster by cluster. And if there is a problem, they'll just like kill the cluster and move it back to 127.
My preference is per policy, mainly because we talked about when someone will want to use webhook versus not, right? And I definitely think that's per policy decision, depending on, for example, does it use referential? Does your cluster support VAP? Like, I mean, that's more of a cluster level. So
yeah, but I think on your case, Rita, if it's referential, it's going to be Rego, right? So it's just going to use gatekeeper in that sense. But this is like users are using cell and they either use the gatekeeper or they use the API server, right? If the APIs are enabled, they may want to just use the API server because it's already cell, right? And maybe we can have an option to turn that off. So like opt out, hey, I don't want to use it,
So your recommendation is
I'm just thinking out loud, not a recommendation, but
so you sorry, we're just talking, but yeah.
yeah.
These are just different options. But like, do we see scenarios where it is a VAP policy, but people may want it a webhook version of it?
Yeah,
And that's a good question. Yeah.
gatekeeper getting ahead of the API server, I think is one. Like if you have like 10 policies, 9 of which are written such that even the beta version of the AP could run them, but then in K8s 130, there's some like new cell function, right, that they've added, because they are adding in like specialized built-in functions to cell K8s. If you have a constraint template that relies on that new function, but you're on K8s 129, like that one constraint template won't work, but all the rest would. So either letting the user manually remediate that situation, or arguably better, altering our driver to specify some minimum version of K8s, which I don't know if we can like detect what version of K8s we're running in, but you know, for that scenario, it would be cool that where we could say, well, we'll just run the ones we can embedded, but don't worry about it. If not, we'll just run them as a webhook.
Yeah, I think in the past we discussed adding some sort of metadata fields to the policies. So say similar to like the require sync data thing. So to check the gatekeeper version, we could also have something like the Kubernetes version there for like cell policies.
Yeah,
so I was just going to say the gatekeeper can check the Kubernetes version, and then depending on whatever the cell function is supported, then it can either then, hey, I'm going to run it, or I'm going to let API server run it.
Yeah, I agree with you. I would put it as a property of the engine rather than as an annotation, because but yeah, I don't know if that precludes also having like manual overrides just for unforeseen circumstances. And maybe we do the manual overrides first because they can perform double duty, but in like a less user-friendly way. Long tail though would be cool. Like if you know, one of our value propositions is like, are you confused as to what's supported where? Like gatekeeper.
It is very confusing, yeah. Especially if you say, hey, Kubernetes 1.29 supports this policy, but not this policy. Yeah, that's going to be another level of confusion.
Yeah, and I don't know if this is true, but I suspect it may be easier for users to upgrade Gatekeeper than their cluster.
And just to clarify on the referential, Sartash, I think even with VAP, we could have referential. I mean, we just, you know, yes, Rego does this today, obviously, but if we want to, we could also enable it for VAP.
In 28 or in
in Gatekeeper, the webhook, because we have all the objects, right?
Got it. So you're saying use the cell policies can use referential,
not
able referential, right?
Yeah, like I think what she's saying is that we could, just as Kubernetes is providing built-in functions for like dealing with amounts or whatever, we could provide a built-in model or built-in function that reads from the cache.
Gotcha. So similar to like the OPA built-in things, we can introduce a cell built-in policy so we can do referential inside cell. I see.
Yeah.
Then obviously that's going to require Gatekeeper, yeah.
Right, exactly.
Yeah,
But, I mean that's also an easy way to tell, right? Because if the policy is using the custom function, then we always default to Gatekeeper then.
Yeah, it's easy to tell if there's some way of either statically analyzing the cell, or like you try to compile it, it fails with a specific error or something like that. Another option could be to create a separate engine, right? Like there's no rule saying there only need be one cell engine. And at that point, we could like straight up own the syntax, you know, and say, well, things like the authorizer will never exist, right? Because we're never going to run in the API server. And you know, like version conversion, maybe we deal with in a different way, that kind of thing.
Or like say, let's say you just care about audit, right? You don't, you also, that's another reason.
Yeah.
Could we do oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, this is the I don't know if this is the Achilles heel of that, but one kind of like flaw-ish is that it is 100% focused on like the webhook user story, which means that it assumes, one, that it's running in the API server, and two, that various request metadata will be there, right? Like requesting user or request method, like is it a update or a delete, that kind of thing. You know, some of that can be glossed over. Some of that you
that's
can't
true
really
today.
export.
Yeah.
What's that?
That's true today with Rego policies, so it's not a regression.
Right. So Rego, we gloss over it, right? We just say, well, if you don't use it, then it's exportable, which isn't like great, because then users need to be aware how a template is written. I think for me, the biggest challenge with VAP and like running in outside API server contexts are, one, its focus on resource rather than kind. And two, its assumption that version conversion is trivial to do. Like it just, and these are actually coupled, right? They sort of are configured like how webhooks are configured, where it's like, I want to listen to version 2 of pods, the resource, right? And the webhook, if someone tries to apply a v1 pod, it will go, okay, but I have this thing that looks at v2 pods, let me convert it and ask. Can't do that shift left. One, you don't know what, like, is lowercase pods capital P pod? Like there's no rest mapper shift left. So you can't run that resource to kind conversion. And two, even if you could, like, unless there's some way to reach out to an API server, which again, you're then assuming connectivity to a specific API server, you don't know how to convert a v1 pod to a v2 pod. Similar to data inventory, input review, fields that aren't available to sell. Input review. Now, input review, so I'm reading Andrew's comment. He's saying, does input review of fields which aren't available in cell? Input review is modeled after the admission review object that webhooks have. This is where our sort of like assumption that it's an admission webhook, you know, and we gloss over things for audit where that kind of comes in. And cell does the same thing. They might have locked down the visibility a little bit. Like I would need to like double check.
I for some reason think when I looked into this a couple months ago, it wasn't identical. I don't remember the details, but I think, for example, I remember being discussed that like user info wasn't previously available, but maybe it'll be available in K8s 128. Don't quote me on the numbers, but I got some concerns there that different, yeah, there might be some differences based in different versions as well in that area. So not just referential, but you know, maybe not everything is exposed, or maybe not everything is exposed in every version.
Interesting. Like I know that they have excuse me, sorry, like the root values it's sort of, they're global variables in cell, object, old object, request methods, I forget all that's exposed there. One interesting consequence, oh, no, okay. Sorry, I was just thinking through, well, adding stuff, you risk a backwards incompatible change, right? Because of collisions at that point. But maybe not, because variables are all namespaced under the variables keyword, and parameters are all namespaced under params. So I don't think the code author can affect the root namespace.
Sure, it's just I know that for sure that there are constraint templates in the library that use, for example, operation. I think I've seen out in the real world people use user info as well. So just identifying that, you know, there may be some sort of mapping needed, and it may be to. I was thinking about the earlier thing, is there a minimum version? Yeah, I don't even know that like the cell beta in 127 versus the cell in 128 might not even have identical stuff.
As far as I'm aware, it is backwards compatible. Like, I don't think they needed to do anything that broke a 127 validating admission policy object.
No, I'm just thinking that, no, I was thinking the other way around. It's just if if you get on an older version than you're expecting, you might not have every property available if they're adding them over time. But that's something to think about.
Yeah, 100%. And I know this is true of built-ins, and variables is another thing that's new.
And I haven't even thought about whether their variables match every sort of parameter type that we support as well. I would assume so for both using like Open Schema v3, but I guess I haven't actually checked that. Like, does it support every object type that we are currently supporting?
Yeah, I think it supports complex objects. That would be, I think, the riskiest bit, like maps.
Sure, yeah, maps. I'm sure things like bools and strings, but we also do quite a few constraint templates. I think have like maps or even nested maps potentially.
Yeah, I think that's supported if I'm reading the code correctly, but it's not something I've experimentally verified, so it's worth actually trying.
I don't want to derail the call. I'm just thinking that if we're talking about potentially re-implementing some policies in Cell, I think that there are probably more edges than there might seem like. That's all.
Oh, 100%. The limits ones, right? The things that require converting CPU and RAM, like those would rely on a cell built-in that I am guessing only showed up in 128. Like, I don't think there's a native way of translating KB, MB, or whatever else into a canonical value in cell, absent a K8s built-in. So it will be interesting to see that. I think that more complex assertions will also be a pain point. Like one reason to avoid with our 127 base stuff trying to do anything too complex is without variables. If you have like compound conditions, right? Like this field must equal this other field, and this other thing must happen, and this other thing must happen. The only way to sort of like chain those together and like make different assertions for different pieces is to like copy and paste things, right? Because you can't declare a variable to make a sub assertion and then go, if this is satisfied, run this check. If this satisfied, run that check. So you could wind up with a very long and repetitive set of cell expressions.
I'm already guessing that some of our cell templates are going to probably look a bit different than regular templates, and that personally, my guess is there's probably going to be more, but simpler ones is kind of like what will happen, but we'll see. Anyway, I suspect most of the more complicated regular templates are going to be not wise to try and one-on-one replicate in cell. I'll just put it that way.
Certainly not in the short term, and yeah, long term. Like, one thing cell will never do is function definitions. Watch them do function definitions, but probably not, because of this like emphasis on static analyzability. And so you will wind up with stuff that is like more compactly expressible in Rego than in cell. That being said, cell probably will wind up being more performant if you could do the expression, even if it is like longer. So, you know, it's not always there's not always a clear winner, I don't think, between the two. To the extent that they overlap, I think there's some subset where it depends what you value. I think there will be a set of non-overlapping things, right? Like the quantities bit, where it requires something outside of cell to sort of bridge that gap.
Could we do external data similar to like the referential, to like we define the function?
Yeah.
Would there be an advantage? And I'm just thinking out loud.
Doing.
Instead
Sorry,
of
Go ahead, Max. Go ahead.
So, an advantage relative to Rego, you were saying?
To Rego, yeah.
So maybe so cell, I think you have some like eye of the beholder advantages, like simplicity, right? If people find Rego hard to write, cell might be a bit more of an obvious syntax. So having the option could be good.
But as far as like
thing
performance or like anything else, that's not like readability sort of thing.
Yeah, I suspect cell will be more performant. I haven't done any performance comparisons. That being said, with something like external data, like once you put a network call in, that kind of goes out the window. But we do have the cache, right? So we're not always putting a network call in, potentially.
That might be interesting to look at too, like in the future, like converting basically all Rego things to cell.
Yeah, and external data actually is probably an easier lift than referential constraint, because we've already written a function, and so we just need to figure out how to rebind it. With external data, do you fail open, closed, etc.? I think it's up to the code author.
Sure, I'm just saying that one advantage of cell being sort of all together is you don't have to make that decision, right?
Don't have to make that decision.
Whether to open, fail open or closed, right? If you're going to depend on external data for referential data, then you're going to have to make a decision. If the external data doesn't come back in time, which direction do you want to do it? Do you assume that there's none, or do you assume that you just have to, always fail and deny or whatever in that case? I'm just saying that's one of the big advantages of cell and not using external data, is you don't have to worry about that.
Yeah, I don't know if that's a cell thing necessarily.
Well, it's more of a generic external data problem. Yeah, not necessarily cell specific. Although I guess what I would say is very unlikely with the current way referential data works in Rego, since it's always in the cache.
Yeah. Well, referential data, the cache could be stale, right? That's sort of a known issue with referential data. That's unavoidable, right? Caches be stale.
True. Yeah, although if you're using it in audit, I guess I'm not overly concerned. I think that's more of a problem for webhook, but yeah. Anyway, we could yeah. I don't want to you know, and I love to think about these things. So anyway, whatever.
Yeah,
that's the whole topic, and I know we're at the end of time.
Yeah. yeah, it's fun to think about where language matters and kind of like where it stops mattering for sure too. And some of that is more just how it's used and the tools it's made available to you rather than like inherent in the syntax of the language.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the thing I'm trying to point out with some of the previous ones. A lot of times people ask me, can this be done in Cell? And I'm like, Cell is just the language. I mean, it really depends more to me on what the data sources are, you know, the built-in data sources or whatever, you know. That's Cell by itself in the middle of nowhere does nothing, right? You know, but Cell running in Gatekeeper might have different data available than Cell running in VAP, which I think where we kind of started this.
Yeah, and at a pure language level, Rego probably gives you more room to self-help because you can do function definitions, because you can do things like argument matching. Like yeah, it's still in the template. Like there's a function written that converts like kilobytes or megabytes into a canonical value.
I'm thinking GOM plating that for Cells probably the solution, but anyway, yeah.
Was that
Since you can't do it directly, you're just going to end up using something like a template and basically just drop it into a Cell thing and have to generate them instead. So that would be my solution to those kinds of reusable modules in the Cell world.
Oh yeah, no, you couldn't even write a reusable module that would do that in the Cell world. Was my point.
Well, I'm not thinking to not in that fashion. Never mind. I'll show you what I'm thinking sometime. I'm thinking of cheating and basically doing a preprocessor that would drop those into a script. Yeah. So Cell doesn't know anything about it.
Yeah, that's kind of what K8s did, right? They wrote a custom function, custom Cell function. Anyway, I realized we just sort of like if chatted. Is there anything more? We're at time. Crickets. I feel like we've bored Rita.
No, sorry. Sorry, I didn't have to drop, but it was really great seeing everybody.
Likewise. And
All right.
hi, Dale. I'm sorry we didn't like. Did you show up for anything or?
Yeah, I work over at Red Hat, and we have I'm trying to learn about Gatekeeper, so I'm just like being a listener, trying to absorb everything I can.
Gotcha. Yeah, sorry we didn't do a welcome thing earlier. Yeah, did you have any questions or anything like that? Sorry, you've frozen for me. Uh-oh.
I was going to say, I feel like the only person I still see moving up there is Charlie in my window, which is not a good sign.
Oh,
No, you guys are both moving. It's just Dale that's frozen for me.
Okay,
so.
Dale's gone now. I guess Max was just being really good at not moving.
yeah, it's called active listening, or I guess I don't know. Is it active listening if you're frozen?
Probably not, right? I don't know. I'll have to think about that.
It's just about not being too distracting, you know, to the person who's speaking.
Yeah, I guess. Yep. I suspect he had an internet problem because he was frozen for a while and it looks like he dropped.
Yeah.
I think he said no though, so that's
Yeah,
good.
it sounded like he said no, he didn't have any questions, so I think it's fair enough if we call that a day.
Cool.
Great.
All right. Well, I'm gonna drop too. Take care, everybody. Bye.
See you now. Bye. See ya. Bye.